Thank you very much for the generous introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here, I have to admit, for the first time in my life in Olomouc, which is a place definitely an early modern historian like myself should visit. And tomorrow I really will talk about an early modern subject, but tonight I'm going to talk about the 19th and 20th centuries. People react to retirement in different ways, and one way in which I reacted was to feel that I was, in a sense, liberated from the obligation to work only on the 16th and 17th centuries, because my job description was to teach European history of that time. And then I was also afraid that after 40 years teaching and writing, I might be saying the same thing again and again, and I thought a way of escaping this might be to work a little bit on the 19th and 20th centuries. And in the hope that if you enter the 19th century, if you like, from the back door, from the 16th, 17th, 18th, it's just possible one might see a few different things from the people who spent all their working life focusing on those centuries. Well, whether this is the case or not, it has allowed me to explore some interesting topics, including this one, which I am more or less beginning. I should call it really a sketch for a history, or maybe even prolegomena to a history, rather than the history itself. Well, what is interdisciplinarity? Some speakers of English try to distinguish it from multidisciplinarity, from cross-disciplinarity, from transdisciplinarity, to say nothing of anti or extra or pre or post-disciplinarity. In this situation of rich confusion, you'll understand why I'm going to stick to the concept of interdisciplinarity as a general term, whether I'm talking about an individual enterprise or about the work of a team, whether I'm talking about attempts to combine different disciplines or to work on topics which, in a sense, fell down into the gap between them. I ought to confess at the start where I'm speaking from. I was trained as a professional historian. Most of my life I practiced as a historian, but I've also spent a fair amount of time in interdisciplinary projects, both teaching in university and in research. My first job, 1962, was at a brand new English university, the University of Sussex, where the scheme was, as they said, to redraw the map of learning by asking all the students to take courses in more than one discipline. Bi-disciplinary seminars were common. But so I'm committed to this, but I didn't come here to praise interdisciplinarity. I'm trying, with a little bit of distance, to say something about its history. And curiously, in the huge literature on the subject, ever-expanding literature discussing interdisciplinarity, there are very few contributions to its history. Now, I think to discuss this topic, I need to say a few words about disciplines, and maybe even about the concept of discipline itself. The word disciplina has been used ever since ancient Rome, not only in education, but in three non-academic contexts. One is athletics, one is warfare, and the other one is religion. Because all three activities require a degree of self-control or even asceticism of a kind, just like the life of the ideal scholar. And then from learning in general, the concept of discipline was extended to different branches of knowledge. In the medieval university, one discipline was law, another one medicine, a third one theology. By the late 18th century, some universities included courses, if not departments, on chemistry, natural history, political economy, and in Central Europe, what they called Kameralwissenschaften or Polizeiwissenschaften, in other words, a training in administration for future officials of the Habsburg Empire. Now, where should one begin a history of this kind? The word interdisciplinarity came into use in English only in the United States in the 1920s. It was used by academic administrators in the Social Science Research Council in New York. By the 1950s, American social scientists were using the word quite a lot. In the humanities, history, literature, it arrived a little bit later, maybe something like the 1960s. But you can't begin with the word, because the practice, as so often happens, is older than the label somebody attaches to it. On the other hand, you can't have interdisciplinarity until you have a system of disciplines. That is, established, institutionalized disciplines, which then somebody wants to move between. So I'm going to begin the story in the middle of the 19th century. The rapid proliferation and institutionalization of disciplines began at that time in Germany, and more or less at the same time in the United States. It's continued to spread ever since. The division of intellectual labor has been going further and further in the universities and, of course, outside them as well. As universities became larger, more numerous, even more competitive, and more closely oriented to research. Because the idea of a research university, that's really a novelty in the later 19th century. In speaking about this proliferation, metaphors are almost inevitable. Geographical metaphors, like field. You meet a colleague at a party, first question, what's your field? Or again, territory. Or again, trespassing. Or there are anthropological metaphors, such as academic tribes. There's an excellent book by a British sociologist of education with the attractive title, Academic Tribes and Territories. Or you can use political metaphors, academic empires, the quest for autonomy, or even secession. In Germany, about the year 1900, the experimental psychologists seceded from the faculty of philosophy because they wanted to be independent. Now, there are serious problems for historians of disciplines. You have to navigate between, on one side, there's a danger of cynicism. That is, to assume that discipline building is simply driven by an urge to power. But equally dangerous is a position of innocence. That is, taking at face value the way in which the professors present themselves and their purely intellectual ambitions. And then again, I think one needs to hold a balance between an internalist explanation, that is, to see the appearance of more branches on the tree of knowledge simply as intellectual growth, or a social interpretation where you view the establishment of new disciplines as so many responses to challenges from the world outside. And of course disciplines are necessary because life is short and there's a lot of knowledge. But they're not natural, although insiders like to present their particular discipline as natural, rather like nations. But like nations, disciplines are cultural constructions. They're historical artifacts and they're subject to change over time. So they're necessary, but they come at a price. The disadvantages of the system have long been apparent. Compartmentalization, intellectual insularity, private languages, jargons that impede communication with the rest of the world, or knowing more and more about less and less. A Cambridge physicist of wide interests once published a book attacking specialization, and he called it Knowing Everything About Nothing. So my theme today is essentially a story of complaint, of attempts at evasion, and finally of attempted remedies. Maybe a few more distinctions. I think there are ambitious interdisciplinary schemes and there are modest ones. At the modest end, people simply want to build bridges between a few neighboring disciplines like sociology, anthropology, and history. At the ambitious end, especially in the middle of the 20th century, you find utopian attempts to end the fragmentation of knowledge, to the dream of unified science. Otto Neurath was crusading for unified science in the 1930s. More recently, in the United States, the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson has a similar dream, even more ambitious, a dream of unified learning. But we also have to distinguish between individual attempts to move between disciplines and the formation of teams of specialists engaged in a common project. And then we also have to distinguish interdisciplinary research from interdisciplinary teaching. On this occasion, I'm going to concentrate on research. I just want to note in passing that mainly from the middle of the 20th century onwards, some universities and colleges, especially new ones, introduced interdisciplinary courses that were compulsory for all students. An early example is the University of Chicago in the 1930s with the so-called Great Books Project. So whatever you would eventually specialize in, you had to read Aristotle and Virgil and other great books of the Western world. More recently in Britain, 2 new universities were founded with deliberately interdisciplinary aims. One in 1949 in Kiel in Staffordshire tried to bridge the gap between what the physicist novelist C.P. Snow was about to call the two cultures. He was complaining in a lecture at Cambridge that the humanists, as he called them, were totally ignorant of science, and that his literary friends had no idea what was the second law of thermodynamics. I'm glad you didn't ask me. And again, Sussex, 1961, emphasized combinations of disciplines. A bit later, Germany, University of Bielefeld, Sweden, University of Linköping, pursued similar ideals. And some relatively new American liberal arts colleges do the same. But now, turning to research, which I want to say most about. And to begin with the complaints. The whole series of complaints about what is variously called academic insularity, or the ethnocentrism of disciplines, or ghetto effects, or even the silo effect. That's a phrase used in management studies. In the 19th century, complaints of this kind were relatively rare. Maybe because the rise of specialization was relatively new. The immediate advantages of specialization were obvious. An awareness of the accompanying problems took a bit longer to develop. All the same, as early as the year 1869, the English language journal Nature was founded, precisely in order to help different kinds of natural scientists communicate with one another. So this communication was already being perceived as a problem in the age of Darwin. And what is more, there were complaints about specialization from the very heart of the new system, by which I mean Germany, especially the natural sciences in Germany. So, two examples are Lothar Meyer and Felix Klein. Meyer was a chemist, but he'd been trained in physiology, and he was also interested in physics. And he used to argue that what he called the now severed sciences needed to be reunited. As for Klein, he was a mathematician, but he was interested in physics. And he tried to persuade the Minister of Education in 1888 to found an institute where there'd be mathematicians, physicists, and engineers, hopefully all talking to one another. On the art side, the complaints come a little bit later. The famous one, I think, still in Germany, is R.B. Warburg. R.B. Warburg didn't work in a university, so he was able to avoid the problem personally. He was a private scholar with money to pursue his interest in Kulturwissenschaften and especially the Renaissance. But he used to tell his followers that they needed to avoid and evade what he liked to call the intellectual Grenzpolizei, that is, people on the frontiers between disciplines, refusing to allow strangers to enter, to trespass. In France, similar complaints were voiced by Henri Baer. He taught philosophy in a school, but it was one of the most prestigious French schools. It was the Lycée Henri IV in Paris. That was Bergson's school as well. And he tried to link history to geography, to anthropology, to sociology, even to psychology. But in the early 20th century, it's the United States where you hear these complaints most often. So I'm offering 5 examples from 5 scholars, each of whom was trained in a different discipline. Charles Merriam was a political scientist, but he didn't think that political science should be independent. He criticized what he called the disintegration of the social sciences. That is, he wanted to talk to sociologists, to economists, and so on. Robert Hutchins began academic life as a lawyer, but he's most famous as head of the University of Chicago, which is where he introduced this famous Great Books program. James Conant was a chemist, but he became president of Harvard. And as president, he expressed great anxiety about what he called the tremendous subdivisions of the fields of learning which occurred in the last 25 years. Next man is a sociologist, Robert Lind, who criticized disciplines, as he said, conducted as internally self-perpetuating academic traditions, and he hoped that they would blur into one another. And finally, the economist, Beardsley Rumel, who was influential because he worked at the Rockefeller Foundation, dismissed what he called the anachronistic categories: history, economics, sociology, psychology, and so forth. Now, if I tried to rehearse the arguments of every individual like this, I would need a whole course of lectures. So I'm summarizing 5 common recurrent arguments. So in the first place, people argue specialization prevents us from perceiving connections. What Diderot once called the interlacing of the different branches of the tree of knowledge. Secondly, the rush to claim intellectual territory, sometimes before your neighbor gets there, has left knowledge gaps between the disciplines. Thirdly, lack of awareness of what your neighbors are doing leads to wasted effort, the reinvention of the wheel. Fourthly, institutionalized disciplines often become inflexible. They go out of date. For example, the distinction between sociology and social anthropology made quite good sense in the late 19th century. But if we were beginning now, don't think anybody would want to make such a distinction. And fifthly, last argument, intellectual innovation is usually a kind of borrowing or adaptation of ideas from elsewhere. Sometimes from another discipline, sometimes from outside the academic world altogether. How did Darwin arrive at the ideas that he put down in The Origin of Species? Well, Darwin's own account emphasizes the writings of 2 men in totally different fields. That he learned from geology to think in terms of millions of years. And he learned from demography, from Thomas Malthus, about the effects of rising populations. And he took these ideas but adapted them to biology and came up with new ideas. Of course, there are counter-complaints at the same time. So some scholars are criticizing disciplines and praising the movement between them, and other scholars are criticizing interdisciplinarity, accusing people who attempt this of superficiality, dilettantism, lack of rigor. The basic assumption of these critics being that only disciplines as currently defined in the university syllabus offer the intellectual discipline necessary for any serious work of scholarship. Now I want to say something about action. So from the identification of problems, we move to attempted solutions. There have been a number of strategies to solve the problem of over-specialization. Once again, I think it might be useful to distinguish 5. At the individual level, people have been brave enough to attempt to live the life of a polymath in the style of Alexander von Humboldt in the early 19th century. But you know, even Humboldt complained, people often say, I'm curious about too many things at once. In a way, Humboldt was one of the last of the polymaths, surviving into a period where it led to disapproval. Since his day, it's become rather difficult to be more than a semi-polymath, that is, someone who combines 3 or 4 disciplines, but not the whole range. The late Pierre Bourdieu, best known as a sociologist, was active as a philosopher and an anthropologist. The historian Hayden White, happily still alive, is as much at home in philosophy and literature, including literary theory, as he is in history itself. Another distinguished semi-polymath, Donald Campbell, called this model the fish scale model of omniscience. That is, he meant a concern with a small number of overlapping disciplines. Campbell himself was officially a social psychologist, but he took an active interest in the philosophy of science, in sociology, anthropology, and biology. Not bad. Alternatively, it was possible, it may even still be just possible, to become what I like to call a serial polymath. That is, people who start in one discipline and move into another, maybe even a third or fourth, in the course of a single career. Franz Boas, best known today as an anthropologist, began as a physicist, moved to geography, and from geography he moved on to anthropology. The Hungarian refugee in England, Michael Polanyi, made a more remarkable move from chemistry to philosophy. Luckily, the University of Manchester was very understanding, and the day he resigned as Professor of Chemistry, they appointed him as Professor of Philosophy, so he didn't have to leave the university. Is there anybody still alive who will fit the model? Well, the best example I know is a man of my age Jared Diamond, who was trained in physiology, became interested in ornithology, went to New Guinea to study birds, became interested in anthropology, and finally, now he writes comparative history. So that's the most interesting possibility. But there are other things that one can do if one does not have the time or the courage to be active in several disciplines. You can create a discussion group. For example, at the University of Harvard in the 1930s, there was an informal group talking about the sociologist Pareto. Of course, there were sociologists like George Holmes, economists like Joseph Schumpeter, historians like Crane Brinton, and even a biochemist, Lawrence Henderson. A little bit more formal, you can found a society, like the History of Ideas Club at Johns Hopkins University. The point of the club was to bring together philosophers, historians, and students of literature, since all three groups were interested in the history of ideas, so they had something common to talk about. Alternatively, found a journal. Henri Baer, whom I mentioned before, launched a journal which he called the Revue de Synthèse, so a journal devoted to synthesis, meaning a synthesis of ideas that came especially from different humanities. Or finally, you found a center or an institute. One president of Harvard, Nathan Pusey, once defined a center as an administrative device for assembling scholars from different disciplines and departments around a shared interest. Famous early example would be the Institut für Sozialforschung in Frankfurt. It goes back to 1923. It was a center described by its director, Max Horkheimer, as a center of interdisciplinary historical materialism. It's a reminder that, of course, Karl Marx, another independent scholar working outside the universities, was never confined by disciplines. Well, I promised a history, and a history is normally told chronologically, so it's time to offer a kind of brief chronological account of this international movement, so far as my limited knowledge allows. So I'm going to say more about the humanities and social sciences, because I know more about them. But two recent remarks about the natural sciences may be worth bearing in mind. The first remark, rather unkind to the rest of us, but probably true, a well-known scientist said, "The physical sciences do it more and without fanfare and self-congratulation." And the other scientist said, "In the United States, since the 1970s, the largest number and the greatest scale of interdisciplinary projects have occurred within the natural sciences and engineering." Well, not surprising, they get most of the government money, but still it's worth remembering when we're talking about the humanities and social sciences that interdisciplinary projects are pursued much more vigorously in the other culture. There's also a point to make about the geography of interdisciplinarity. The movement's very strong in the English-speaking world, in France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Scandinavia. Beyond that, I haven't found so much. Of course, that might be my personal ignorance of Central Europe, China, Japan, whatever. If people like to inform me about local interdisciplinary projects, I'll be more than happy to learn about them. But now comes the chronology. Once again, I'm starting in the later 19th century. And I think the place to start is not the university at all, but industrial laboratories, the home of what was later called research and development. So a whole group of North American companies competing, of course, with one another. General Electric, Standard Oil, Eastman Kodak, Bell Telephone, they all established research laboratories before 1914. The aim was pragmatic, so bring together different kinds of experts but working on a common task. Outside the university, the people were simply not interested in disciplines. They just wanted to get a certain job done. In universities, all this happens a bit later. I think the 1920s are a critical decade for translating criticism of specialization into action. On the side of the humanities, History of Ideas Club at Baltimore, Medieval Academy of America, which medieval studies, not just history, but literature, philology, art history, archaeology. In the case of social sciences, the foundation of the American Social Science Research Council. And as I just said, the Institut für Sozialforschung in Frankfurt, which is where the Frankfurt School emerged. And finally, Institute for Human Relations at Yale University. Human relations being a sort of umbrella to cover economics, politics, sociology, and so on. In the 1930s, the trend continued. The first of the great institutes for advanced study, founded at Princeton. That's the time of Otto Neurath and his Institute for the Unity of Science, based in The Hague. This is the time that French historians of the Annales School are trying to reunite history with sociology, economics, psychology, and anthropology. And then came the Second World War, and you might have expected that the war would interrupt the movement as it interrupted so many scholarly activities. On the contrary, wartime governments, especially but not exclusively the United States, followed the model of General Electric and the other companies. So they employed academics on collective projects without worrying about their discipline. Making the atom bomb at Los Alamos required not only physicists, but other kinds of scientists, like radiologists, to measure the fallout. In the social sciences, the Ethno-Geographic Board was established to help the war effort. And the military thought not in terms of disciplines, they thought in terms of regions, theatres of operations. And as the Second World War turned into the Cold War, then the American government and the Ford Foundation founded interdisciplinary centres in what were called area studies. The basic idea was to gather information that they hoped would be of immediate use. So you have the Russian Research Center at Harvard, 1947. The story of Latin American studies in the United States is rather similar. Extremely weak until Castro took over Cuba. And then, miraculously, money was forthcoming to found centers of Latin American studies at Columbia University and after that, many others. So area studies meant bringing together scholars from the different social sciences, but to work on one country or one region. But working together, you could say interdisciplinarity was a byproduct. It was an unintended consequence of the foundation of such centres, where economists, anthropologists would meet one another every day when it was time for a coffee break, and of course they could exchange ideas. The practice spread to other countries, thinking, for example, of the Osteuropa Institute in West Berlin, founded 1951. Leaving the government aside, you find a movement to reunite the social sciences was still going on in some American universities. You have the foundation of the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences in Palo Alto in California. You have an Institute for Communications Research founded in 1947 by Wilbur Schramm. But probably the best example of interdisciplinary cooperation and also competition comes in the natural sciences at the time of the discovery of the structure of DNA. The Rockefeller Foundation put a lot of money into interdisciplinary programs in biochemistry and supported people like Linus Pauling, a chemist who very cheerfully trespassed into the area of the biologists. However, Pauling, as you know, didn't get there first, and the breakthrough came in Cambridge, England, with the English biologist Francis Crick and the American geneticist James Watson, beating Pauling to the goal with the help, not fully acknowledged at the time, of a crystallographer, Rosalind Franklin. So the 50s seem rather like a continuation of the 40s. But I think the 60s were a bit different. They were a decade of great excitement, conflict, and innovation. I'm speaking not only as a historian, I'm speaking as a witness because I was teaching in universities for most of that decade. And they present new initiatives in different places and in different intellectual domains. The decade began with the foundation of a Center for Cognitive Studies in Harvard. Psychologists, philosophers, and neuroscientists worked together, I think, for the first time. In Britain, think of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, founded in Birmingham, 1964. Brought together sociologists and literary critics. You might think an unlikely pair, but a lot of innovative work came out of that combination. People like Stuart Hall, fascinated by theory, working alongside Richard Hoggart, who was more of an old-fashioned literary man. In France, this is the time of the foundation of the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme. That was the initiative of Fernand Braudel, a historian who thought in the same interdisciplinary way as Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre. Febvre, I should say, being a great friend of Henri Baer, that philosopher who did so much for interdisciplinary work right at the beginning of the 20th century. In Germany, the 60s is the time of the foundation of the ZIF in Bielefeld, that is, the Zentrum für interdisziplinäre Forschung. It was the idea of Helmut Skelsky, sociologist of wide interests. And it's hard to continue because since the end of the 60s, there's been such an incredible proliferation of interdisciplinary societies, journals, centres, programs. I think it's impossible to count them anymore. I'll just mention a small number that I think have been particularly important. A succession of institutes of advanced studies on the Princeton model, where you normally go for a year, and so you have a group of scholars, often in related disciplines, with a chance to talk to one another daily. One of these at Wassenaar in the Netherlands, then came the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, then came the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study in the Social Sciences in Uppsala. Then came Collegium Budapest, which unfortunately has closed. And in more recent years, more and more of them, I've lost count of them. And then new centres and new societies. The Association for Interdisciplinary Studies, the Centre International de Recherche Transdisciplinaire, or the Centre Léo Apostel in Brussels, named after a Belgian philosopher who promoted interdisciplinary work for most of his life, or Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies, University of Amsterdam. But most wide-reaching of all, as you know, the last few decades have seen a major shift in undergraduate education. The shift from disciplines to bundles of studies, though they've been established for different reasons, ranging from the political to the vocational. There are a lot of separate stories to tell and a lot of distinctions to make, but I don't really have the time. Some departments of theology have turned into the more ecumenical religious studies. Some departments of art history have transformed themselves into visual culture studies. In both cases, theology and art history, these moves have been extremely controversial, and some scholars extremely unhappy with them, others find them exciting. Courses in literature have often turned into Renaissance studies, cultural studies, or post-colonial studies. Then there are the more pragmatic bundles, like business studies, development studies, organization studies, translation studies, urban studies, media studies, or communication studies, developing out of what in the 1920s would have been called departments of journalism, or I think in Germany they called it press science, Zeitungswissenschaft. More political, because of being associated with campaigns for recognition, think of women's studies, gender studies, lesbian and gay studies, black studies, and now, more recently, Latino studies. In the natural sciences, the equivalent of studies is, I think, the rise of departments of sciences in the plural. So you have packages such as earth sciences, life sciences, health sciences, environmental sciences. Originally I thought that earth sciences might be a euphemism for geology, but actually it's more interesting, more complicated. It does, that kind of label does bring together scholars with very different kinds of training. Cognitive studies, of course, crosses the boundary between the famous two cultures. And finally, interdisciplinary studies shows the movement turning in on itself, for better or worse, I'm not sure. Now, the big question, why has all this been happening? As I have suggested more than once so far, initiatives have come at least as often from outside the university as from inside. The role of governments in Germany from the 19th century and in the United States in the 20th, it's been crucial. So has the role of foundations, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, Gulbenkian. Institutions which favour practical results and therefore support interdisciplinarity not on principle but for pragmatic reasons. So, industry, foundations, governments and the universities themselves. I think this is the moment to stand back and try to take stock, that is, to draw up a balance of what has actually happened. Has the battle for interdisciplinarity been won or lost? In the 1990s, one optimistic commentator claimed that what he called transdisciplinarity was now the norm. He claimed that we live in a post-disciplinary world as well as a postmodern world. Personally, I think that he was exaggerating the speed of change. As I see it, returning to those almost unavoidable political metaphors, the academic Cold War between specialists and generalists has been replaced by coexistence on campus. One part of the campus, you see departments of a single discipline. On another part of the campus, you see institutes or centres of studies in the plural. Interdisciplinarity dominates the centres, but the disciplines still dominate the production of PhDs. The balance shifts from time to time, but not always in the same direction. Some famous initiatives have been halted. The Yale Institute for Human Relations was ended in 1949, 20 years after it began, when the funds were cut off. The sociologists went back to a department of sociology, the economists to the department of economics, and so on. At the beginning of the 21st century, the University of Sussex abandoned the interdisciplinary schools of study, social studies, European studies, African and Asian studies. It abandoned all that for disciplinary departments, claiming it could not get good enough students as long as it claimed to be an interdisciplinary university. So, coexistence. And what this means in practice at an individual level, I think, is many scholars now have double citizenship. They have allegiance to a discipline, but they also have allegiance to a geographical area, like Russian studies, or maybe a problem area, such as urban studies. There's less compartmentalization than there used to be. maybe at an undergraduate level there's also less rigor. But any discussion of the state of knowledge today needs to look beyond the universities as well. It's been argued recently, private industry competes successfully with universities for talent because it isn't restrained by out-of-date disciplinary structures. But of course, that's an old story. It goes back to the research labs of the late 19th century. Well, a narrative of events usually gives a misleading triumphalist impression. You see the foundation of one center after another, and you think the tide is running in favor of interdisciplinarity. The pressures to continue to specialize are much less visible, but they may often remain extremely powerful. Hence, I think, any future history of this topic needs to find space for what I'd call the phenomenon of cycles. That is, first of all, innovators go trespassing beyond the frontiers of their own discipline. They borrow in order to create something new. But if they're successful, they often end up creating a new discipline. Think of all the hyphenated disciplines: biochemistry, astrophysics, sociolinguistics, sociobiology. They all began by trespassing. Or think of more complex mixtures, such as cultural studies, incorporating sociology, film studies, visual studies, and so on. In the first generation of a new discipline, as in the case of a new university, you see what I would like to call a magic moment of informality, openness, and creativity. But then, inevitably, comes the moment of routinization, or in the famous phrase of Thomas Kuhn, the time of normal science that necessarily follows a breakthrough, a scientific revolution. So in the history of knowledge, as in the history of religion, informal sects turn into formal churches, complete with an ecclesiastical bureaucracy. What was once charismatic becomes bureaucratic. The process of discipline formation may be necessary, but the consequence is that the work of trespassing has to be done all over again. In the 1990s, the Gulbenkian Foundation financed a report entitled Opening the Social Sciences, making them interdisciplinary. But a better title would have been Reopening, because what Emmanuel Wallerstein and the other members of the committee recommended was essentially a return to the Institute for Human Relations at Yale or the Department of Social Relations at Harvard. So, for this reason, to conclude, I'm reminded of the myth of Sisyphus, and especially of the comment on the myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, for whom this myth provided an image of the human condition. In the conclusion of his essay, Camus suggested that we should think of Sisyphus as a happy man. Il faut imaginer Sisyphe heureux. Thank you.
As a literary historian, I have of course, problems with cultural studies. And I'm not the only one, as I found out when I was presiding over the European Association for American Studies, that literary people were leaving, in fact, this association. Now, my problem is, and you said you spoke a few complaints about that appear of cultural studies and some interdisciplinary phenomena. Now, I was interested in how do you see the tension between cultural studies spreading and the emergence of multiculturalism, because that makes it very, very dense and very, very sort of complicated.
Thank you. Well, let's begin by making sure that we mean the same thing by multiculturalism. So I would like to distinguish what I call descriptive multiculturalism, which is simply to recognize that in a country like Britain, there are many immigrants from different places, and to be more precise, in London schools at the moment, the pupils have 250 first languages between them. But then there's normative multiculturalism, which suggests that one way to deal with the situation is to encourage people to keep all the cultures they brought with them, and contrast that with the suggestion that they should be more or less integrated into majority British culture. Now, cultural studies certainly would be a good place for people to be studying this question, provided that they recruit some anthropologists and sociologists. It doesn't matter what they call themselves, as long as they have experience of fieldwork, because I don't think you can study these immigrant groups just by circulating a questionnaire. Somebody has to be living with them, like hanging out with them for a considerable time. Some sociologists and anthropologists outside cultural studies already do it. I have a friend in Cambridge who is herself a Sikh. She's trained as an anthropologist. She worked in Sikh communities in the Midlands and investigated attitudes to marriage, the extent to which a younger generation approved of arranged marriage because it showed that the Sikhs were different. So the consciousness of belonging to a particular minority group was so strong that young people were prepared to give up their liberty of choice in the spouse. So if cultural studies, as it usually is in Britain, is a majority of people studying literature or who were trained in the study of literature and are trying to move on to something else, I'm not sure that is the best group. But if cultural studies is a home for sociologists, anthropologists, as well as students of literature, then yes, I would agree with you that might be the place to study this particular question.
Well, how to successfully work within a group of experts from different fields. Because there is very often a problem to accept the different frame within which we work. So if you have any recommendation.
Thank you. Definitely no grand recipes for success. I think probably I made it obvious earlier that I think that modest interdisciplinarity, that is, bridges between a very small cluster, that's got a much greater hope of working than what I called utopian interdisciplinarity, which would be to restore the whole unity of knowledge. And I think, again, informal and small groups work better than formal and large groups. But then the price that the informal small groups pay is that they don't last so long. So for that reason one needs to found these institutes and centres, but once one founds some kind of institution, there's the danger that sooner or later the people in it will be working against the original idea instead of in favour. So it's partly because of tensions like that that I'm a bit reluctant to offer any general recipe.
There is no more questions. Then thank you very much for your lecture, and let me invite you for tomorrow's lecture. It starts at 9:45 in the morning. So it will be about cultural hybridity, the case of Italian Renaissance. So you are warm welcome.